Hi everybody, this is Professor Kirkham, and this is a short video on writing the kinds of paragraphs that you'll need to write for the papers we're going to be doing for the rest of the semester. So for the second paper and for the third paper, the research paper, you're going to be writing body paragraphs that connect primary and secondary sources. And so this video is going to take a look at what those paragraphs need to have in them and show you a sample of how you might put them together. All right, so for body paragraphs in research writing, you're usually drawing connections between primary and secondary sources. For us, in this class, the detective stories will be our primary sources. That means they'll be our source texts, the text that we are building our arguments from. But we'll also be using secondary sources, so articles that you will read and other sources that you might find to support what you're saying about those detective stories. And those will be our secondary sources. So far you've already read a couple of things that would be considered secondary sources. The Auden article and then the excerpt from Nickerson's book are secondary sources. So in terms of the structure, a body paragraph in a research essay looks a little bit different than the kinds of paragraphs that you've been working with already. So far you have to focus on a topic sentence, the setup to a quotation or evidence, and then an explanation and analysis of that evidence. What makes a research essay a little bit more complicated is that usually you've got at least two pieces of evidence or two things that you're trying to draw together. So the structure of the paragraphs in which you do that become a bit more complicated. You're always going to start off with a topic sentence, and in this case the topic sentence is going to be identifying the main connection between the secondary and the primary source. Then you're going to want example or evidence from source A, and source A might be the primary source, or it might be the secondary source, depending on the argument that you're making. You'll want some explanation of that evidence, and you'll then want to connect source A to source B somehow, and we'll look at an example of how to do that. You're going to then want an example or evidence from source B, and an explanation of that evidence from source B, and then you're going to want some final analysis from you that pulls everything together. All right, so you're going to start by drawing connections. You need to find significant connections between the primary and secondary sources. You want to avoid the obvious things that are just basic, simple observations because you're going to be using this to make an argument. So you want to find things that are a little bit more complicated. Make sure that the connection you find supports or explores your main argument or thesis. And you want to use your thesis to help you find the connections you discuss in your paper, but remember that the connections you find may in turn reshape the thesis. One thing we've been talking about a lot this term is the way that we have to draft a thesis and then revise it. And that's going to happen here with these two papers. I know some of you have said to me, I'm just going to come up with a better thesis to begin with. It actually doesn't work that way. You start with a thesis and then you refine it as you keep going. And you'll see as we go through the sample paragraph here that I've put together that you may end up, I felt like after writing that sample paragraph that I needed to go back and revisit my thesis. So that's a normal part of the process. So one of the things we want to do is identify the key points. And from that we've got to start maybe from an argument that we think we're going to make. So let's say that my draft thesis, the thesis I think I'm going to try to prove in my paper, is this. Even though we read detective fiction to find out the solution, the middle of the story is actually the best part, and the solution is almost always a letdown. All right? So in this case, I'm arguing that the best part of a detective story is the middle. That the end, even though we want to go to the end, we want to get to the end, and that's part of what keeps us reading, that part's not as good. All right, so here's some things I've got to think about in terms of key points I might want to make. Number one, possibility A. Why do we read detective fiction? What makes it engaging? Possibility B, why is the middle the best part? Possibility C, why is the ending a letdown? And possibility D, which I left blank because other things may occur to you as you're looking at this thesis. So I'm actually going to pick this first one to work with, possibility A. Why do we read detective fiction? What makes it engaging? And that's going to start to think about this first part of the thesis here, even though we read detective fiction to find out the solution. I'm going to be sort of looking at why we read detective fiction in the first place. So next thing I want to do, not the first thing, but the next thing, is to locate some quotations. Look for quotations that illustrate the connection that I want to make between sources. Look for quotations that illustrate the key point I want to make with these sources. So for example, I pulled this quotation from the Terence Rafferty article. You're going to read this, I think, in 2 weeks. And he talks about why we enjoy being confused while reading a mystery story. He says, quote, "We enjoy the feeling of being overwhelmed by masses of contradictory seeming data, because the promised resolution, the daylight when the fog lifts, is so pleasurable." So I like that quotation because it really talks about what it is that people are looking for in detective fiction and why there's this tension between being sort of puzzled and yet being willing to be puzzled. He's saying we like being puzzled for some reason, and I want to think about why that is. All right. Then I want to find a connected quotation from one of the stories that we've read. So to show a connection between this idea and one of the stories we've read, you might want to choose a passage that illustrates a moment when someone in one of the stories comments on why they enjoy mysteries. And one of the things I noticed was that happens a lot in the Sherlock Holmes stories. So, for example, this passage from The Adventure of that should be The Speckled Band, might work well because it describes John Watson's response to being woken up by Sherlock Holmes to join him in hearing about a potential case. Remember, Sherlock Holmes wakes him up. He comes and knocks on his door and bangs, to wake up Watson. And he says, "Well, Mrs. Hudson woke me up, so I had to wake you up." And Watson says, "I had no keener pleasure than in following Holmes in his professional investigation, and in admiring the rapid deductions as swift as intuitions, and yet always founded on a logical basis, with which he unraveled the problems that were submitted to him." So again, there's this idea of enjoyment. Remember in the first quote, there was something about enjoyment. Here we've got no keener pleasure. Okay, so I want to think about the connections between those quotations and use those connections to draft a topic sentence. I want to think about the connection and aim to capture it, get it down precisely and directly in my sentence. I want to try to capture the significance of that connection, why it might matter. And, if I'm noticing a contrast between the sources that I want to bring out, I might use a word like although, despite, or while to begin my topic sentence. One thing I really want to avoid in my topic sentence, and this is important in any research writing, don't begin with one of the authors. In other words, do not begin your paragraph with, "according to Rafferty," or "Doyle shows us." That's not how you want to begin a paragraph. It's not setting the frame for the discussion clearly enough. And one of the things that you're doing as the writer is framing the discussion according to what it is that you want to show us about these pieces of evidence. All right, so here, let's get a little more deep into the topic sentence. I'm going to ask myself, what are both of these quotations about? Well, they both mention puzzles. For example, the Rafferty mentions contradictory seeming data, and the Watson quote mentions problems. Both say something about solutions. The Rafferty mentions this idea of resolution, and Holmes is mentioned as someone who is able to unravel mysteries. So I'm going to put these together with this idea of enjoyment and say, this might be my possible topic sentence. A large part of the reason we enjoy mysteries is that we enjoy watching as a puzzle is solved. So I've got this idea of the puzzle coming from these two observations and the idea of the solution coming in here. All right. Now, to get from my topic sentence to the quotations, I need to provide some context before the quotations. So I'm going to take each quotation and write a sentence or maybe 2 sentences that come before it to set up the quotation so that the reader can understand why I am indicating that this quotation, that this piece of evidence is important and that it's connected to what I'm talking about. So you want to include context your reader will need before each quotation. In the first one, I might set it up by just mentioning the fact that this comes from an essay. So in his essay on contemporary mysteries, Terence Rafferty explains that because readers look forward to the solution, they can take pleasure in the mystery itself. If you look at it, this is a little bit like a paraphrase of the quotation. And I can do that because I'm going to set off the quotation right after it, and this helps me explain the quotation a little bit before I bring it in. So it's I've got the colon there to set it off, and then I say, quote, "We enjoy the feeling of being overwhelmed by masses of contradictory seeming data, because the promised resolution, the daylight when the fog lifts, is so pleasurable." Notice I don't need to have the citation here because I'm in the same sentence and I've mentioned the author's last name here. If there was a page number, I would need to put it in, but this is a source that we don't have page numbers for, so we won't use them. All right, and here's the second quotation down here. So I've got to set this quotation up somehow, and I want to indicate who's talking and in what particular scenario. So I say John Watson, the narrator of Sherlock Holmes' stories, so enjoys watching Holmes solve cases that he doesn't even mind being woken up early to come out and meet a potential client in the adventure of the Speckled Band. So what I've done there is I've told you who's speaking, what his relationship is to Sherlock Holmes, and I've indicated the title of the story so that the reader has a little bit of context here. And then I'm going to just give a little tiny intro into the quote. I said Watson claims he has, quote, "no keener pleasure than in following Holmes in his professional investigation and in admiring the rapid deductions with which he unraveled the problems that were submitted to him." And I actually took out a bit of the quote because it was too long. And when you take out part of the quote and you're still in the same sentence, you're going to use these three little dots. I know you all call them ... but they're actually technically called ellipses. All right, now I've got to explain the quotations. It's not enough just to set them up. I have to add something after. All right, so here we are with Rafferty again. And so I've added a piece after the quotation here in this dark red. Even though the readers are confused by all of the pieces that do not yet make sense in the story, they experience that confusion as something pleasant because they know clarity will come by the end of the story. So that little explanation there, so I've added that additional explanation of what the quotation is saying so that I can draw out what I think is important from it. For example, this idea of confusion I think is really important, but also this idea of pleasure and this idea that the pleasure is dependent or needs the clarity in order to enable us to enjoy the confusion. In other words, we only like the confusion if we know everything's going to be cleared up. And that's important, I think, when we're talking about detective fiction. All right, here's the second example, quotation explanation Holmes. So here's the little setup for the Holmes quotation. There's the Holmes quotation. And then I've added a little explanation here. Watson is admitting that he himself does not understand how the mystery is solved. But he says that watching Holmes as he solves a case gives him a particular kind of sharp enjoyment that is better than anything else. And here I wanted to stress this idea that Watson mentions that he has no keener pleasure. So the idea is that this is like better. He likes this better than anything else, which is also really interesting and important to bring out. All right, then I've got to draw a connection between the two chunks of text I've got now. I've basically got 3 sentences that relate to the Rafferty quote, and I've got 3 sentences that relate to the quote from the Doyle story. I've got to bring them together somehow, so I need to find something between them. So I need to draft a sentence or phrase that can go between the quotations to highlight the connection. This sentence is shaped by the larger point I wish to make. So here's one that I tried. Even some of the characters within detective stories seem to enjoy the confusion of a mystery because they trust that the detective can solve it. And the reason I set it up this way was that in the first part where Rafferty is talking, he's talking about what readers in general feel about mysteries. But then when we look at the example from Holmes, we see that it's talking specifically about Watson, and he's a character in that Holmes story. So I wanted to bring out the idea that it's not just the readers, but also sometimes the characters who have this feeling of pleasure that is related to the solution and the confusion of the mystery. All right, so now I can put all of this stuff together, but I'm not done. I know you were hoping I was done, but I'm not, because I've got to add some analysis. So, this is going to be hard to read because it's so big. All right, here's my whole paragraph until we get to this little gray part, which is the part I've just added. So you can see I've got the topic sentence here. I've got that Rafferty chunk. I've got the transition sentence between Rafferty and then going into the second example from Holmes, here's the whole Holmes chunk, and then I still have to add some analysis from me. Okay, so here's the whole paragraph, but I've also added this additional point of analysis. And what I've tried to do here is bring out the tension that's already in these examples. Because even though they're both saying people like to read a mystery, they don't mind being confused, they're also saying the only reason they don't mind that confusion is that things get explained at the end. So I wanted to kind of turn this around and say, if these examples are correct, however, we only enjoy being confused if we know the writer or the detective will clearly and satisfyingly explain all of our confusion. If the ending is not a promised resolution or a true unraveling of the problem, we may feel very differently. So this sets me up to go into a second paragraph that might talk about what happens when we don't feel like there's a resolution or a true unraveling of the problem. And that should be able to help me, support my larger claim about what we expect from a mystery and what happens when we feel like the middle is actually better than the end, that the end is somehow unsatisfying. Okay, so now I've got this really pretty solid paragraph, but you know what I have to do next? I have to ask myself if I need to reshape the thesis. And I'm not going to go through how I might do that here, but I want to make it clear that you often need to do this after writing the paragraphs that come out of the examples and evidence that you've found in the sources. Having written the paragraph, always ask yourself, do you need to revisit your thesis? Here, for example, I wound up writing something that is a bit different than I might have expected. In looking closely at some examples, I found that we as readers have certain expectations about how a mystery resolves. So I will probably need to explore what those expectations are next. That wasn't really something I was planning to do when I drafted my thesis. But because I've done this work with the sources, now I'm seeing there's something else I have to talk about. And, if this happens to you, don't despair. This is actually a good sign. It means that you're deepening your discussion, you're widening your discussion. And so I may need to take another look at my thesis and decide if I want to argue something more nuanced. So as I said at the beginning, there's this kind of, I guess you could call it a feedback loop, where you are drafting a thesis, using the thesis to help you shape your body paragraphs, but then also after you write your body paragraphs, looking again at your thesis to say, have I really stated very clearly what I seem to be arguing in this paper? Okay. So as I said, this video was designed to talk to you about those body paragraphs in the research essays. And you will be in the second paper and in the last paper writing paragraphs like this. So it's important to understand how dense and complex those paragraphs are going to become. I hope you'll have a chance to watch this and maybe watch it more than once as you're doing your drafting. Remember, of course, that the topic sentences that you come up with and the examples that you come up with are going to be very different depending on what it is that you're arguing. This was just meant to be an example. All right, take care.